Throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus, to our surprise, has often attempted to keep his ministry a secret. You remember some of the instances. He would heal this person or that person, and they would express their gratitude, and there would be this excitement, and he would say, "Don't tell anybody. Keep it a secret." Rarely did it remain a secret. After all, Jesus, with his ministry, was so spectacular, people often found out, and the crowds would follow him, and word would spread, opposition would arise, but by and large, Jesus gained a following, and people knew that he was engaging in this ministry, even though there was some attempt to kind of keep it in-house. It's surprising to us because it's ingrained in us that we're supposed to tell people about Jesus, right? Evangelism, let's talk about the kingdom, let's talk about the gospel, and let's talk about wholeness, and let's talk about all the things that Jesus wants to do to restore and minister to us and care for us and make us fully who he wants us to be, enabling us to be in ministry with him and on his behalf. But still, he's attempting to keep things secret. Well, in chapter 11 of the Gospel of Mark, that changes, doesn't it? Here, for the first time, as Jesus rides into Jerusalem with the crowds shouting and celebrating that he is the Messiah. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. For the first time, Jesus is hailed publicly, visibly celebrated as Israel's Messiah. Now the tone changes quickly, doesn't it? We go from this rich, celebratory, exciting moment, and only a few verses later, everything has turned dark. Jesus is flipping over tables and stopping the activity that's happening in the temple and declaring God's judgment. And so there's this action, this crucial moment where he's publicly hailed as Messiah, but it doesn't stay very happy. The question for us then becomes, what's the problem? What's he upset about? Why is Jesus angry? Why is he enacting this righteous anger? And it comes through in a quote that he gives from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 57, which is then followed by one from Jeremiah. We'll talk about those in a few minutes in more detail. For now, hear the words again. My house is to be a house of prayer for all the nations. We're going to discover as we read this text quite closely and hear what Jesus has to say and consider it in light of the whole biblical story, that Jesus is driven here by a passion for the nations. He is focused on his desire and God's desire to bring the nations to worship in the temple. That's not happening, and that's Jesus' concern. Mark helps us see how crucial this is with this image of the fig tree. Again, we'll do some more detail in a minute or two. For now, we get an image of a withering tree as opposed to a thriving tree. And Mark wants us to connect the dots between passion for mission and thriving, fruitful ministry. He wants us to see that a passion for missions drives a thriving church. Passion for the nations to know God drives healthy, thriving, vital churches. Now, Jesus is not launching this as a new idea. If you read through the Old Testament, it's there all over the place. In fact, Jesus is quoting, as we said, Isaiah 57. There is this motif, this idea that goes all the way through the Old Testament that God calls a people for himself in order to bring the nations to him. He doesn't go to every nation at once. He calls one nation and elects one nation on his behalf to bring all the others to him. We get this in Genesis chapter 17, as God's promise to Abraham is reiterated. I'm going to take your family, and I'm going to make your family a blessing to every family in the world. Remember Abraham, unable to have children. He'd grown very old, and God miraculously gives him a family. God gives him a son, and his grandchildren expand, and it's more people than the sand on the seashore, the stars in the sky. And the promise of God is that that group of people, the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, are going to be a blessing, not just amongst themselves, but for all the families of the earth. So from the first book of the Bible, this global, multinational, multi-ethnic aim, purpose, goal for the people of God, the family of Abraham, is built in from the start. It doesn't stop there, does it? We often reflect together on Exodus 19, where Abraham's family has just been brought out of captivity in Egypt, and they come to the foot of Mount Sinai, and God says to them, I want you to be for me a kingdom of priests. Every nation in the world belongs to me, God says. I want you to be a special nation and a priestly nation. And what does that mean? It means they are intermediaries. Priests stand between God and the others and cultivate a relationship. So you've got God on the one hand, you've got the nations on the other, and you've got Israel in the middle, bringing the two together with this priestly vocation. One nation for all the other nations. Comes up in Psalm chapter 2, again, a common text that just drives our understanding of this. God says to his son, ask of me, and I will give you all the nations as your inheritance. This global vision shows up in Genesis, shows up in Exodus, shows up in the Psalms, and Jesus quotes the prophets. If you go back and read the whole of Isaiah 57, and Jesus, in all likelihood, is quoting more of it, and Mark just gives us a snippet. In all likelihood, he is at very least evoking the sensibilities of Isaiah 57. It's this rich, spectacular text. I want to read just a bit of it to you, beginning in verse 6. The foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in the house of prayer, in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. And this is the part Jesus quotes, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, for all the nations. So you can see there's this movement. Isaiah sees a day when God would show up, and when he shows up, foreigners, the nations, all the families of the earth would flock to Jerusalem, would flock to Zion, would rush in to worship in the temple, the one true God. They would walk away from their idols and walk away from false gods and come to worship the one true God. And that movement has been at the center of the vocation of the people of God from the start. And Jesus evokes that when he quotes this passage from Isaiah in the midst of his temple cleansing moment. This is what it means for him to be the Messiah. He is bringing the vocation of Israel to be a nation, a light to the other nations, to the center. He is bringing that to the heart of his ministry. And then we have to ask the question, why? And the answer is because he cares more about the salvation of the nations than he does himself. This drives the passion of our Lord. His passion for the nations drives his passion to the cross. We're told here, just a few verses after Jesus cleanses the temple, when the chief priests and the scribes hear this, they are looking for a way to kill him. He'd had people plotting before, but this seems to have amplified that effort. It seems to have accelerated the effort to kill Jesus. And so the powers, the authorities are looking for a way to destroy him. Mark wants us to see especially that Jesus is filled with this passion and it drives him. One of the ways we see that is by comparing the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. If any of you are teachers, when you see the same material in papers from different students, you might be inclined to think they had maybe shared some resources or something like that. Well, Matthew and Mark and Luke share a lot of material, and somebody's looking at somebody else's text. And it's very interesting to see sometimes they frame things a little bit differently, not contradictorily, not in contradiction to one another, but to amplify particular aspects of the character and nature of Jesus. And so if you read the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 21, where he describes this cleansing of the temple, he also tells us that Jesus quoted Isaiah, "My house shall be a house of prayer," but that's where he stops. That's where he finishes off the quote. Again, who knows how much of it Jesus actually said. These guys are filling in, like, you know the background, here is a taste of it. But Mark adds those 4 extra words, that one prepositional phrase, "My house shall be a house of prayer." That's where the other gospel writer ends it. Mark amplifies this one particular thing, "for all the nations." And he does that to highlight for us Jesus' passion for the nations, a passion that carries him to the cross to purchase our redemption, to purchase redemption for all the peoples of the world. How much does he care about the nations? He cares enough to give his life. How much does Jesus care about the mission of the church? He cares enough to allow his body to be broken and his blood to be shed, to die a gruesome, torturous death, so that we, through faith in his name, can be reconciled to God. And not only reconciled, but can become his representatives for the reconciliation of all the nations. This is what Jesus wants. This is his passion. And that kind of passion drives thriving churches. Passion for that mission drives thriving churches. Now, if we're going to really see what's going on with Jesus in the temple, we need to think about kind of the floor plan and the structure of the temple a little bit. Jesus comes into the temple. When you first come in, you're in this big courtyard kind of area. And in the center of the temple is a building that houses the Holy of Holies. And depending on who you are, you can get closer to it, right? The most holy place, you've got to be, the more holy you are, the closer you can get. And so the least holy people have to stay in the outer court, and there's kind of this graded status thing, and the holier you are, the closer you can get to the presence of God. And remember, the temple didn't just symbolize the presence of God, it was the place of God's presence. When Solomon built the first temple and dedicated it, the glory of God descended on the most holy place, and it was visible, and it was bright, and it was robust, and it was rich, and it was so glorious that the priests had to back up because they couldn't stand to minister in front of that place. And over time, as the people of God fell into sin and didn't honor God and worship him, he had to do something drastic to get their attention. He sends them into exile, and he removes his presence from the most holy place. The glory departs from the temple. And even when the people came back to the land, the glory never returned. Not like that. Even when the sacrificial system was reinstituted, the glory never returned. But the temple still was considered the place. This is where heaven and earth overlap. And if you want to enter the gates of heaven, you go to Jerusalem, you go to the temple. This is where Yahweh, the God of Israel, dwells. And so the outer court was called the court of the Gentiles. People from foreigners from all the nations could come there and worship the one true God. People who were not part of the ethnic family of Abraham could come to this large space on either side of the most holy place, but outside of it, and worship. They couldn't go in. That was reserved space, but they could come this far. Now, if you were an Israelite woman, you could go a little bit further. You were considered a little holier than the average Gentile. And so there was a court of the women. That was the kind of the next step in. And if you were an Israelite man, you were considered a little holier than the women. Take that for what you will. And you could go a little bit further in, but not all the way. And if you were a priest, you could go a little further than the average guy. And if you were the high priest, you could go all the way into the most holy place, but only once a year. And so you kind of see how the holier you are, the closer you could get. And everybody knew just how holy they were, whether you like it or not, right? Your space is very much defined. So Jesus comes into this court of the Gentiles, and that's where tables and booths had been set up for buying and selling animals to be used in the sacrifices. Now, a lot of us read this text and we think, there's some unjust business practices. Maybe they're changing money and they're not, like, it's not a very fair commission or exchange rate. That's probably not what's going on. More likely is that here is the one place in the whole world where non-Israelites can worship the one true God. And it has been designated and zoned now for commercial businesses. What's going on there? Well, think about the sacrificial system. If you lived far away from Jerusalem and wanted to come offer a sacrifice, you needed to bring your best sacrifice, whether it was a dove or a lamb. And when you start that journey, maybe you got to go 3 days, 4 days, a week, however far it is, you start that journey, your best lamb is your best lamb. It's pretty, it's lovely, it's white, it's healthy. But after 3, 4, 5 days traveling through the desert or the countryside or the wilderness, your best pretty white lamb is not your best pretty white lamb anymore. It's your dirty lamb, and maybe it got into a tussle along the way and something tried to eat it and it scratched up, or maybe it tripped and broke its leg. And you can't offer a lamb with a broken leg on God's altar, can you? That would profane. That's not an appropriate sacrifice. And so the guys in the temple said, "Hey, you know what? There's a market for this. We could put a business plan together, and we'll just tell people, like, send it out. We'll run a Facebook ad, and you'll let people know you don't have to bring your own animal. We have one here. They'll be great. They'll be in good condition. No broken legs, no scratches, no scars. Beautiful white doves, lambs, all the stuff. Leave yours at home. Travel to Jerusalem. We'll sell you one when you get here. Then you can." Make your sacrifice. Jesus' beef is not that they are doing sort of unjust, like charging too high of a commission on the offering or something like that. His frustration is that they have taken the place where the nations were supposed to be, one place in the whole world where the nations could come to worship the one true God, and they've basically turned it into a marketplace. So try having your quiet time in Walmart one day, and you'll get a feel for what this is like. Maybe Walmart before COVID, when it was bustling and packed out on a Saturday morning or something. But you get the idea. Like, you can't just worship God if people are running around and, where are the bananas and all that kind of thing, right? I mean, it's difficult. We have spaces set aside for worship and spaces set aside for commerce and spaces set aside for home, all these kind of things, right? And these folks have taken the one place in the world where the nations can come to worship God. This is God's passion. This is what He wants. From Abraham to the Psalms, to the Exodus, to the prophets, God wants the nations coming to Jerusalem to worship Him. You say, "God, what do you want?" He says, "I want the nations to come to Zion, to the temple, to worship me, and here's the designated space, and you guys who are supposed to be guardians of the space are turning it into a supermarket and selling stuff instead." No wonder Jesus flipped the tables. His people had betrayed their vocation to be a light to the nations. They were withering. They were fruitless. We learn a lot about Mark's view of Jesus in texts like this, because here Jesus is doing something that only God has the authority to do. His declaration of judgment on the temple is something only God could do. And if you read through the prophets, Jeremiah chapter 7, which Jesus quotes, "You've made the temple a den of robbers," is all about how God is judging the unjust practices of the temple. Malachi chapter 3, "The Lord whom you seek will come to the temple, but who can stand the day of His coming?" He's like a washer's soap or a refining fire. It's not going to be all happy, happy, joy, joy when He shows up. He's going to have to deal with your junk and sin and transgression. Jesus comes to the temple. He is the glory of God. He is the presence of Yahweh. He is the Lord whom you seek, and He has come. And no one was ready to receive Him or surrender to Him. Instead, they made plans to end His life. They had lost their passion for being a light to the nations and had built a system to pad their own pockets and advance their own interests. And Jesus came in and turned the tables over. Because Jesus knows that thriving congregations, thriving expressions of God's people is deeply, deeply tied to passion for mission. And this comes into even clearer relief when we consider this poor fig tree. Wasn't even the season for figs, and Jesus curses it for not having figs. And we think, what in the world? Has he just gone off his rocker and lost his mind? Why would he expect there to be fruit on the tree? It's not the right season. And Mark, we need to understand, likes to take different kind of texts, different vignettes, and wrap them together, kind of interweave them together, and let them comment on each other. So you've got Jesus comes into the temple, takes a look around, goes out. Jesus happens on this fig tree. It doesn't have any fruit on it, so he curses it. Jesus goes back into the temple. He sees the fruitlessness of the temple system. He flips over the tables by declaring the judgment of God. He comes back out, sees the tree again, and it's withered and dead. Mark wants us to understand that the tree is a parable of the temple. And when Jesus flips the tables, he is declaring God's judgment, God's curse on the whole system with all of its corruption, having betrayed its vocation to the nations for self-preferential, we've got all the light, we'll keep it to ourselves. Jesus says, if that's the way you want to do it, expect to wither and die. Jesus says, if you don't have your mission to the nations, if you don't share my passion for the prayers of the nations, don't expect to thrive. Expect to wither and die. Passion for the mission drives thriving churches. So how do we become one of those? The good news is I'm incredibly excited that there is a growing passion. There was a passion for mission here in Hope Hall long before I arrived, and it has only grown, and it is a joy to be a part of that. I had a chance to sit down with our missions chair last week, a few days ago, Mike Forster, who's worshiping with us in one of our earlier services this morning, and we celebrated just how in the last few years, there's always been this deep commitment to the mission of the church. We're so grateful that our leadership has focused on building that over the last few years. And he and I were able to kind of sit there and just reflect on and celebrate that growth and how we've got folks who've been around for a long time involved in the mission, and we've got folks who maybe have been around and weren't involved, who are getting involved, and then we've got other folks who haven't been around, but now they are around, and they're getting involved in it too. And it's growing in a variety of ways. And so I want to spend a few minutes reflecting on how we can share Jesus' passion for the nations in the most effective way. First of all, when we talk about missions, we talk about three spheres of the mission. We've got local missions, kind of in our area. You can drive there, or in one day, in a few minutes perhaps. You've got domestic missions, maybe it's in another state, somewhere else in the country. May take a little bit longer to get there. And then you've got international missions. Probably need a plane ticket for this one, unless it's Mexico or Canada, right? So local, domestic, global. Those are our kind of three spheres in which we think. And in each sphere, we want to be thinking about partnerships and how we can develop our relationships and our ministry in those different settings. So locally, this church has been very involved in Friendship Mission in Montgomery for years. A number of you have served in that capacity. I'm so grateful for that. It's really rich. We're excited that there are some new things, some new opportunities for service and ministry with the folks at the Friendship Mission. If you want to get involved in that, I can connect you with the folks. We'll make it happen. It's an exciting opportunity, and we're going to be able to continue to do more things. I won't say everything yet, but I'm happy to say we've been talking about some other local opportunities. People said, hey, we want to be able to plug in. We want to get connected. We're excited about the mission. How can we do it? And you'll get a chance to hear about those more in the weeks and months to come. But we are always, always, always paying attention to existing relationships and looking for new local relationships where we can be in ministry together. Domestically, a number of you have been to Sager Brown Depot in Louisiana and worked in the different kinds of ministries they have there. So we've got folks doing that. And then internationally, we are looking at places around the world where we can invest in long-term strategic partnerships with indigenous missions and missionaries that support the indigenous church. So some of us have been to Guatemala the last couple of years. We wanted to go this summer, but they shut the whole thing down and we couldn't get there, which is regrettable, but we're trusting Jesus that he's still got plans, and we're going to keep that relationship alive, and we'll get back there. And we want these kinds of relationships, whether it's Central America, whether it's Africa, whether it's Europe, Asia, wherever we find ourselves, whatever relationships God helps us cultivate, we want those to be long-term strategic relationships. Because think about it this way: you can do global missions and short-term mission trips in two different ways. One is to go to a different place every year, right? And a lot of churches do this. And we've decided not to go to a lot of places every year. So Honduras one year, and Guatemala the next, and Costa Rica the next. Instead, we are looking for places where we can go back again and again and again, and here's why. Let's say you go to a different country every year, and let's just say it costs $1,000 to get there and everything. After 20 years, you've spent $20,000. That's a lot of money. And you're doing well if you remember the names of the people on that first trip. Because after all, you've been a lot of places and you've seen a lot of folks, and you've got a lot of memories, and you built some, the people on the trip is a good friendship, there is some fruit. But what if you took that 20 years and that $1,000 a year and you put it into the same place year after year after year? What if you went to the same orphanage and church and ministry in Guatemala for 20 years? And you knew the names of the folks there, and you connected with them on social media platforms, and you were emailing them, and maybe you did an internship there one summer, and maybe some of them came up and joined us for a missions emphasis weekend, and there's this long-term deepening, ever-deepening friendship and partnership, and you can say, you know what, we've been investing resources into this place for decades, and we can see the fruit, and we remember 10 years ago when we built that pavilion, and look how it's being used to minister to families now, even later. And there is the opportunity when you dig in deep to one place and focus the resources, personnel, time, finances, all those things in one place for the long haul, you get to see cumulative fruit. You get to see kids grow up knowing Jesus. You get to places where you can trust deeply the folks you're partnered with. And what I want you all to see, whether you're in the room or on the other side of a mobile device on the live stream, is that everything we do is aimed at strategic, thoughtful, long-term, missional fruitfulness. Nothing is haphazard, nothing is accidental. Everything is on purpose and strategic, and it is so because Jesus embodies God's passion for the nations. Jesus insists that this is essential for thriving churches. We want to be a church that embodies Jesus' passions and his heart. We want to be a church that's thriving. So we're going to work hard, and we're going to keep working hard, and we're going to keep working harder. And I can't say enough about our folks who are pushing it forward and who are leading the charge and celebrating it. And our missions team, they find creative ways to raise funds and recruit other people, and it's rich and it's important, and I'm excited about it. Deeply, deeply, deeply excited about it. Not just because we get to do some stuff and go on some fun trips and maybe change one or two persons' lives, because it is an opportunity for us to live into what Jesus wants. He is the King of the kingdom of God, and this is what he has called us to do. This is who he has called us to be. Churches that embody Jesus' passion for the mission. Passion for mission drives thriving, vibrant churches. It's not the sort of thing that you just get to a finish point and you're done. Just like with our health, right? The healthiest people in the world are the ones who are always paying attention to their health. Thriving churches are ones that are always paying attention. How can we be better? How can we thrive? How can we work? How can we change? How can we improve? How can we shift something? How can we learn? How can we be better? How can we go for a higher level of excellence for Jesus' sake? So the invitation is to commit again. Today, tomorrow, the next day. Jesus, we want to be fruitful for your sake and for the sake of the nation.